heard the chainsaws before I saw them. By the time I got outside, they were already into the trunk. My oak tree, the one my grandfather planted the year he came home from the war, the one that had been standing on that corner of our property for 71 years, was coming down in pieces while an HOA board member stood on the sidewalk watching with a clipboard and a smirk. I did not yell. I did not cry, though I wanted to. I just stood there and I watched them finish, and when the last section hit the ground, I pulled out my phone and I made one phone call. The person I called is the reason that 47 homes in Maplewood Ridge went completely dark for 11 days in October. Stick around, because what I did next was completely legal, entirely deliberate, and more satisfying than I have words for. My name is Robert Aldridge, and I have lived at 9 Sycamore Court for 38 years. I moved into this house when I was 29 years old, newly married to my wife Diane, with a second-hand couch and a truck full of boxes and the particular optimism of young people who have just signed their first mortgage. The house was modest, a 3-bedroom colonial on a corner lot, and it needed work in the way that houses bought at the edge of your budget always do. But the corner lot had something that no amount of renovation could replicate. It had an oak tree. The tree was planted in 1952 by my wife's grandfather, Thomas Ellison, who had purchased the land before the neighborhood was developed and had lived on the property in a farmhouse that was later demolished when the subdivision went in. Thomas had planted the oak the year he came home from Korea, which was 1952, and he had planted it in the southwest corner of the lot, where the afternoon light was best and the soil ran deep. He told Diane's father that he planted it because he wanted something on that land that would outlast him. He was right about that. Thomas died in 1987. The tree was still there the morning the chainsaws came, 71 years old and magnificent, with a canopy that spread 40 feet in every direction and a trunk you could not wrap your arms around. When Diane and I bought the house, Thomas was still alive and still sharp, and he walked the property with us on the day we closed, and he put his hand on the bark of that oak, and he told us that the tree was part of the deal. Not legally, not in the documents, but in the way that old people mean things when they say them plainly and look you in the eye. He said, "Look after it," and I told him I would. Diane was standing beside me, and she heard me say it, and for 38 years that promise had been as real to me as the mortgage. The oak was not just a tree. I know that sounds like the kind of thing a sentimental person says, and perhaps I am a sentimental person, but I want to try to explain what I mean precisely. The tree was a presence. It had been there through every season of our life in that house. It was in the background of Diane's pregnancy photos. Our daughter Rachel learned to climb in its lower branches. Our son Mark built a platform between two of its major limbs when he was 12 and spent an entire summer up there reading and refusing to come down for dinner, which drove Diane to distraction and which I secretly admired. The tree had grown with our family. Its canopy was the first thing I saw when I pulled into the driveway after a long day, and in 38 years, I had never once not noticed it. The neighborhood association had existed in some form since the development was established in the 1970s, but it had operated for most of its history as a loose cooperative more than a governing body, the kind of organization that organized a July 4th cookout and occasionally sent a letter about someone's peeling paint, but was not in the business of making anyone's life difficult. The first president I actually remembered was a retired postal worker named Dave Kowalski, who served for 11 years and whose primary achievement was negotiating a group rate on snow removal that saved everyone about $60 a winter. Dave understood the assignment. He was there to make the neighborhood function a little more smoothly, not to run it. Dave stepped down 6 years ago. The election that followed was, in retrospect, a turning point that most of us did not recognize as such at the time, because it presented itself as nothing more than two people running for a volunteer position that nobody particularly wanted. One of them was a woman named Louise Hartford, who had been on the board for 2 years and who ran on a platform of maintaining what she called the neighborhood's legacy character. The other was a man named Phil Coaster, who had moved in 3 years prior and who ran on what he called a vision for excellence. Phil won by 4 votes. I did not vote. I had been at a work conference that week and Diane had forgotten to drop off the mail-in ballot. This is the kind of small domestic failure that you forget about entirely until its consequences become apparent, and by the time its consequences became apparent to me, I had thought about that unmailed ballot more times than I can count. Phil Coaster was 44 years old, owned a software company he had sold for what he described in various conversations as a significant sum, and had moved to Maplewood Ridge because, by his own account, he had grown tired of the city and wanted a neighborhood with character. What character meant to Phil, as it became clear over the following 3 years of his presidency, was primarily a visual standard that he found personally satisfying, and that he was prepared to enforce through the HOA's fine and compliance mechanisms with an enthusiasm that had no apparent upper limit. In his first year, Phil revised the architectural guidelines to require pre-approval for any exterior modification to any property, including paint color changes, fence installations, addition of garden structures, and the planting or removal of any tree or shrub over a certain diameter. The pre-approval process involved submitting a form to an architectural review committee, which Phil chaired, and which met on the second Tuesday of every month. If you submitted on the third Wednesday, you waited 6 weeks. The process was not designed for efficiency, it was designed to assert control. In his second year, Phil introduced the Neighborhood Enhancement Initiative, which was a program under which the HOA board could identify properties that, in its judgment, needed aesthetic improvement and could send formal notices requiring specific changes within 30 days. The fines for non-compliance started at $200 and doubled every 30 days. 3 households on our street received notices that year, including my neighbor Alan, who was cited because a section of his front walk had settled unevenly, and Phil had determined that this constituted a hazard and an eyesore simultaneously. I received my first notice in Phil's third year. The notice concerned my oak tree. Specifically, it cited a provision of the newly revised landscape guidelines that required any tree with a canopy extending over the public right-of-way to be trimmed to maintain a minimum clearance of 12 feet above the sidewalk. The oak's lower branches, which swept out toward the street in the way that old oaks do, were at some points closer to 8 or 9 feet above the sidewalk. The notice gave me 60 days to bring the tree into compliance or face a fine of $300 per month. I read the notice twice. Then I called my neighbor Sandra, who was a retired attorney and who had been following Phil's activities with the careful attention of someone who recognized what was happening and was waiting for the right moment. Sandra read the notice over the phone and said that the provision about sidewalk clearance was a legitimate safety concern in principle, but that the 12-foot requirement was stricter than the county standard, which was 10 feet, and that before doing anything I should check whether Phil had the authority to set a stricter standard than the county code. I looked it up. He did, technically, under the HOA's authority to establish landscape standards more restrictive than municipal minimums. So I had the tree trimmed. I hired a certified arborist, a man named George Bettman, who had been working with large specimen trees in our county for 20 years, and I asked him to bring the canopy clearance over the sidewalk to 12 feet while preserving as much of the tree's natural form as possible. George knew the tree. He had trimmed it twice in the previous decade, and he approached this job with the care it deserved. The work took 2 days and cost me $800. When it was done, George walked the entire canopy perimeter with a measuring pole and confirmed that every point over the sidewalk cleared 12 feet. I took photographs. I sent a written notification to the HOA with the photographs attached, documenting compliance. Phil's response was to send a second notice 3 months later. This one cited a different provision. Under the new notice, the tree was in violation of the sightline clearance standards for corner lot properties, which required that no tree or shrub in the visibility triangle of a corner lot intersection exceed 4 feet in height. The visibility triangle is a standard traffic safety concept, a triangular area near an intersection where obstructions are limited to preserve driver sight lines. The provision itself was not unreasonable. The problem was that the oak tree's trunk, which was what occupied the visibility triangle, was not an obstruction to sight lines because drivers could see beneath the canopy to the street beyond. The provision was clearly written to address shrubs and hedges, not a 70-year-old tree with a canopy that began well above a driver's field of vision. I wrote back with Sandra's help, explaining this distinction and citing the specific traffic engineering standards that defined sightline obstructions. The HOA's response, signed by Phil, stated that the Architectural Review Committee had determined that the tree constituted a visibility obstruction under the current guidelines and that removal was required within 90 days. Not trimming, removal. I read that word several times, removal, of a 71-year-old oak tree that Thomas Ellison had planted the year he came home from Korea, because Phil Coaster had written a provision about shrubs in visibility triangles and had decided to apply it to a tree. I called Sandra. I told her what the letter said. There was a silence on the phone that lasted long enough that I asked if she was still there. She said she was and that she was thinking. Then she said, "Robert, do you want to fight this or do you want to win?" I told her I wanted both. She said good, and that I should come over tomorrow morning and bring the file. Sandra had been quietly building a legal analysis of Phil's HOA governance for over a year. She had documented the provisions he had enacted without proper community notice, the fines assessed under those provisions, the architectural review processes that did not follow the charter's procedural requirements. She had been waiting, as she told me that morning at her kitchen table, for a case that was clear enough to make the larger argument. The tree removal order, she said, was that case. Her analysis was detailed, and I will summarize the key elements. First, the provision Phil was relying on had been enacted without the community vote required by the HOA charter for any amendment that created mandatory property modifications. Second, the application of a shrub height standard to a tree was legally indefensible because the provision's plain language referred to plantings and shrubs, not established specimen trees. Third, the demand for removal rather than trimming was disproportionate and unsupported by the stated safety rationale, since any legitimate sightline concern could be addressed by removing lower branches. Fourth, and this was the one Sandra delivered with the quiet precision of someone who has been practicing law for 30 years, the tree's status as a specimen tree over a certain age and trunk diameter potentially qualified it for protection under the county's tree preservation ordinance, which Phil had apparently not checked. I had not known about the county's tree preservation ordinance. It turned out to be significant. The county had passed it 8 years prior in response to widespread removal of mature trees during a development boom, and it established a registry of protected trees, defined as trees over a certain size and age that provided documented environmental and community benefit. Registered trees could not be removed without a county permit, which required demonstrating that removal was necessary for safety reasons that could not be addressed by trimming, and which required a hearing before the county's tree board. The oak qualified. Sandra walked me through the registration process, and within 3 weeks I had submitted the application, which included George Bettman's professional assessment of the tree's size, age, health, and community value. The county tree board reviewed it and added the tree to the registry within 60 days. I notified the HOA in writing that the tree was now a registered protected specimen under the county ordinance, and that any removal order from the HOA was superseded by the county's jurisdiction, and that any attempt to remove the tree without a county permit and hearing would constitute a violation of the county ordinance and would be addressed accordingly. Phil's response arrived 2 weeks later. It was not the withdrawal of the removal order. It was a fine notice for failure to comply with the removal order, assessed at $300 per month retroactively to the date of the original notice. Sandra read the fine notice and said, carefully and precisely, that Phil had just made a significant mistake. She began drafting the lawsuit the same afternoon. I want to pause here and explain something about the next part of this story, because it is the part that people find most interesting and that requires the most context to understand properly. The thing that I did, the thing that blacked out 47 homes in Maplewood Ridge for 11 days, was not something I planned from the beginning. It was something I was able to do because of who I am and what I have spent my career doing, and it presented itself as an option at a specific moment in the legal process when I was looking for every piece of legitimate leverage I had. I am an electrical engineer. I spent 31 years working for the regional power utility in our state, the last 14 of those as a senior infrastructure planning engineer. My specific area was grid connectivity and easement management, which is the technical and legal side of how power lines get placed on private property and what rights the utility retains over that placement. I know easements. I know the law around them. And I know, because I have spent 3 decades working with this knowledge, that most people who own property do not fully understand the easements that run across it or what those easements permit. The day I got Phil's fine notice, I went to my home office and I pulled out the property survey I had received when Diane and I bought the house 38 years ago. I had looked at this document perhaps a dozen times in those 38 years, and I had always focused on the property boundaries and the building setbacks. I had never, until that afternoon, focused with real attention on the easement notations. There was a utility easement running along the back portion of my lot and the adjacent lots on our block. This was standard, and I knew about it. The power lines that served our street ran on poles at the back of the properties, and the easement gave the utility the right to access and maintain them. Nothing unusual. But there was another notation. A narrower easement, 15 feet wide, running across the southwestern corner of my property. It was described in the survey as a utility access and maintenance easement granted to the Regional Power Authority. I read the description 3 times. Then I called a colleague from my utility days, a man named Frank Delano, who now worked in the utility's legal and easements division. I asked Frank a question. I told him I had a 15-foot utility easement across the corner of my property, and I wanted to understand what it covered and what rights the utility had under it. Frank said he would look it up and call me back. He called back the next morning. He said the easement in question was a legacy distribution easement from 1967 that had been granted as part of the original electrification of the subdivision. It covered access for a secondary distribution line that ran from a transformer on the street down to a junction box at the back of my lot, where the underground service lines branched out to serve a portion of the neighborhood. The junction box was still there, Frank said. It was under the slab at the back of my property, beneath where the old garden shed used to be. And the easement, Frank said, was fully active. I asked Frank what was located within the 15-foot easement corridor. Frank checked the survey coordinates. Then he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Robert, are you aware that there is a structure in your easement?" I told him I was not sure what he meant. He told me that the survey data showed a structure within the easement corridor that had not been there when the easement was originally recorded. He described its position. I walked to the southwestern corner of my property while he was on the phone, and I looked at what was there. It was a brick pillar, one of the decorative entrance pillars that Phil Coaster had installed on behalf of the HOA 2 years ago, part of the Neighborhood Enhancement Initiative's new entrance feature, a pair of brick pillars flanking the entrance to Sycamore Court with the name of the development in bronze lettering. The pillars were handsome and expensive, and Phil had been visibly proud of them. One of them was sitting squarely inside a utility easement. I stood on my lawn in the afternoon sun looking at that pillar, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger, something more like the sensation of a door opening. I told Frank what I was looking at. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Robert, you know what this means better than I do." I told him I did. Then I thanked him and ended the call and went inside to find Sandra's number. Sandra picked up on the second ring. I told her what I had found. There was a pause, and then she made a sound I had never heard from her before, a brief, delighted laugh, quickly controlled. She said, "Robert, I think we need to talk about the complete picture of what we are dealing with here." I told her I agreed. I told her to bring her notes and I would bring mine, and we would figure out together exactly how large this picture was. It was larger than either of us had expected. Sandra came over that evening with 2 folders and a yellow legal pad. I had my property survey, the easement documentation Frank had sent me, and the complete file of HOA correspondence going back to Phil's first year. We sat at the kitchen table and spread everything out and spent 2 hours going through it systematically, and by the end of those 2 hours, we had a picture that was considerably more interesting than just one misplaced pillar. The entrance feature that Phil had installed on behalf of the HOA consisted of 2 brick pillars, a decorative iron gate that stayed permanently open but was there for visual effect, and a section of low brick wall connecting the pillars on either side. The project had been commissioned without a community vote, approved by Phil's Architectural Review Committee, which Phil chaired, and paid for from HOA reserves that had been allocated by a board resolution that had also not gone to the community for approval. The total cost had been $14,000. The eastern pillar and wall section were on HOA common area property, which was appropriate. The western pillar, which was the one Frank had identified, was on my lot, inside the utility easement, but there was more. Sandra had pulled the county property records for the lots adjacent to mine, and the low brick wall section on the western side extended not just onto my property, but also partially onto the property of my neighbor across the corner, a retired teacher named Dorothy Webb, who had never been told that the decorative entrance feature of her neighborhood partially occupied her lot. Dorothy had not complained because she had not known. Most people do not study their property surveys with the attention that a retired utility engineer might bring to them. Phil had counted on this, consciously or not. The entrance feature sat where it sat, looked handsome, and nobody had checked the lines. Sandra was particularly interested in one additional detail. When Phil had filed the improvement application with the county building department for the entrance feature, which was required because the brick structures exceeded a certain height, he had submitted a site plan that showed the western pillar located entirely on HOA common area. The property line on his submitted plan was not accurate. Sandra put my survey next to the plan he had submitted, and the discrepancy was not subtle. He had shifted the property line on his drawing by approximately 8 feet. Whether this was deliberate or careless was a question for a later proceeding. What it meant in the immediate context was that Phil had filed an inaccurate site plan with the county building department, which was a separate problem from the easement issue and one that had its own regulatory implications. I called Frank back the next morning. I told him that the utility easement had a structure in it and that I wanted to understand what the utility's position was regarding encroachments on active easements. Frank, who had 20 years in the utility's legal division and knew exactly what I was asking, said he would need to escalate the question to his supervisor and get back to me. He called back in the afternoon. He said the utility's standard position on easement encroachments was that they needed to be removed. The utility's right to access and maintain the infrastructure in the easement corridor had to remain unobstructed, and any structure that impeded that access was subject to a removal order. He said that if I wanted to formally notify the utility of the encroachment, I could submit a written complaint with the survey documentation, and the utility would initiate its own review process. He also said, and I appreciated this, because Frank is a precise man who chooses his words carefully, that the utility's infrastructure within that easement served a section of the neighborhood, and that if the easement access were compromised to the point where maintenance could not be performed, the utility would have no option but to isolate that section of the grid until the access issue was resolved. I asked him what isolating a section meant in practice. He said it meant disconnecting the affected distribution line from the grid, which would result in an outage for the homes served by that line. I asked how many homes were on that line. He looked it up. He said 47. I thanked Frank and ended the call. Then I sat in my kitchen for a while and thought about 47 homes. I thought about Phil's house, which was on Sycamore Court, and which I was fairly certain was among those 47. I thought about the oak tree that Thomas Ellison had planted in 1952. I thought about my promise to look after it. Then I drafted the formal encroachment complaint to the utility. Before I sent it, I spoke to Sandra again. I told her what the utility had told me about the potential outage. I told her I wanted to be certain that what I was doing was legitimate before I did it. Sandra thought about it carefully. She said that filing a complaint about a real encroachment on a real utility easement was not just legitimate, it was potentially my legal obligation as a property owner. If the encroachment compromised infrastructure, I had some responsibility to protect. She said that the consequences of that complaint, including any outage that resulted from the utility's response, were the utility's responsibility to manage and were not something I caused in any legally meaningful sense. She said what I was doing was using the legal and regulatory systems exactly as they were designed to be used. I told her that was what I wanted to be sure of. She said she was sure of it. I sent the complaint. The utility's response was faster than I expected. An inspector came out within a week. A young man with a tablet who measured the easement corridor, photographed the pillar, documented the infrastructure in the easement, and took a copy of my survey. He was professional and thorough and did not comment on the situation beyond asking me factual questions and thanking me for my time. 10 days after the inspection, the utility sent a formal notification to the HOA. The notification stated that a structure had been identified within an active utility easement on a property adjacent to HOA common area, that the structure represented an encroachment that potentially compromised access to distribution infrastructure, and that the encroachment would need to be remediated. The notification gave the HOA 60 days to remove the structure or provide a remediation plan, and stated that if the encroachment was not addressed within that period, the utility reserved the right to isolate the affected infrastructure pending resolution. Phil received this notification. I know this because Sandra, who is now in regular contact with 3 other board members who were increasingly unhappy with Phil's direction, was told about the meeting where he addressed it. Phil's response to the board, according to Sandra's source, was that the utility notification was routine and that he would handle it. He did not tell the board that the pillar was on my property. He did not tell the board about the inaccurate site plan. He told them it was a minor administrative issue that he would resolve with a phone call. Phil did not make the phone call, or rather, he made calls, but not productive ones. He called the utility's customer service line, which was not the right line for this type of issue, and was told that easement matters were handled by a different department. He called that department and was told that the encroachment notification had been issued by the Infrastructure Compliance Office and that any response needed to be in writing. He drafted a letter asserting that the pillar was on HOA property and that the utility's survey data was incorrect. The utility's response to that letter, which arrived 3 weeks later, noted that the survey data had been independently verified by a licensed surveyor and was accurate, and reiterated the 60-day remediation timeline. At this point, the timeline was approximately 30 days from the utility's deadline. Meanwhile, Sandra had filed our civil suit. The suit named Phil Coaster individually and the HOA as an entity. It addressed the removal order for the oak tree, the fines assessed under the improperly enacted visibility triangle provision, the pattern of bad faith HOA governance, including the provisions enacted without proper notice, and the $14,000 entrance feature project approved and funded without a community vote. It sought an injunction against the removal order, return of the fines, and damages for the costs I had incurred, including the $800 arborist bill, the county registration fees, and attorney fees. We also filed a separate complaint with the county building department about the inaccurate site plan Phil had submitted for the entrance feature. This was not a civil matter. Submitting inaccurate survey data to a county building authority when applying for a permit was a regulatory violation with its own consequences, and the building department opened an investigation. Phil became aware of the full scope of what was happening approximately 2 weeks before the utility's deadline. I know this because he called me. It was a Thursday evening, and I was eating dinner, and my phone showed his name, and I almost did not answer. I answered. He said he wanted to discuss the situation. I told him I was happy to discuss anything he wanted to discuss, and that my attorney was available for any substantive conversations. He said he did not want to involve attorneys. he wanted to talk neighbor to neighbor. I told him that his attorneys had been involved in every communication with me for 18 months and that I saw no reason to change that dynamic at this point. He said things had escalated beyond what he had intended. I said I agreed with that characterization and suggested that the place to address it was through the legal process that was underway. He said the utility situation was creating a problem that affected the whole neighborhood. I told him the utility situation had been created by his decision to install a structure on my property without checking the survey or the easements. He said he had not known the pillar was on my property. I told him I accepted that he may not have known. I also told him that the inaccurate site plan he had submitted to the county was a different matter and that not knowing where the property line was did not explain submitting a drawing that showed it in the wrong place. There was a silence. Then he said he thought we could work something out. I told him that working something out was exactly what the legal process was designed to facilitate, and that I looked forward to seeing his attorneys at the scheduled mediation. Then I wished him a good evening and ended the call. The utilities deadline arrived on a Tuesday. By that point, the HOA had retained an engineer to assess the cost of relocating the pillar, which they had finally acknowledged needed to happen. The relocation plan was submitted to the utility 4 days before the deadline. The utility reviewed it and determined that it was acceptable as a remediation plan, but that the actual relocation work needed to be completed before they could close the encroachment notice. The work would take, according to the HOA's contractor, approximately 3 weeks to complete. The utility said that was acceptable, but that in the interim, pending the physical relocation, they needed to perform a maintenance inspection of the infrastructure in the easement corridor that had been deferred specifically because of the encroachment. The inspection required temporary isolation of the affected distribution line. The isolation began on a Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock. 47 homes in Maplewood Ridge lost power at 9:03 a.m. on a Wednesday in October. I was in my kitchen with a cup of coffee when it happened. I did not need to look out the window to know it had, because my own house was not on that line and my lights stayed on, but I could hear it, the specific sudden quiet that settles over a neighborhood when the ambient background hum of 47 homes worth of electrical equipment goes silent all at once. I sat with my coffee and I listened to that quiet for a moment. Then I looked out the window at the oak tree, which was standing in the morning light exactly as it had stood for 71 years, every branch in place, the canopy full and gold in the October sun. I thought about Thomas Ellison. I thought about him coming home from Korea in 1952 with whatever he had seen and whatever he had carried, and standing on his land in the Central Plains and putting a tree in the ground and saying this is something that will last. I thought about the promise I had made to him and about what keeping a promise actually requires when the thing you promise to protect is under direct attack. Then I went to my home office and I began preparing for the mediation that was scheduled for the following week. End of part 1, continued . Running part 1 total, approximately 6,700 words. HOA DSTOADMY Oak Tree, part 2. Volscript part 2 hook, 20 seconds, . Last time I told you about Phil Coaster, the HOA president who ordered my 71-year-old oak tree removed because of a shrub height provision, installed a brick pillar on my property inside a utility easement without checking the survey, and then told the board it was a minor issue he would handle with a phone call. Today I am going to tell you what happened when 47 homes went dark, what happened at the mediation, and what it looked like when a man who had spent 4 years treating the neighborhood like his personal property portfolio finally ran out of room to maneuver. Stay with me. Main script part 2 . The outage lasted 11 days. I want to explain why it lasted 11 days, because this is the part of the story that people find surprising and that requires some technical context to understand. When a utility isolates a section of distribution grid for maintenance, the restoration timeline depends on what the inspection finds. In this case, the inspection of the infrastructure in the easement corridor revealed that the junction box under my rear lot had not received scheduled maintenance in several years, partly because the access to it had been complicated by the proximity of the pillar, and that several of the connections in the box needed to be upgraded to current standards before the line could be safely re-energized. This was not something the utility had caused by isolating the line. It was a maintenance backlog that had accumulated and that the inspection had now surfaced. The utility communicated this to the HOA on the first day of the outage. They said the restoration timeline was dependent on the maintenance work and that the work would proceed as quickly as resources permitted. They said they regretted the inconvenience to residents. 47 households in Maplewood Ridge spent 11 days in October without electricity. Phil Coaster's house was among them. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do during those 11 days. I did not gloat. I did not post about it on the neighborhood's social media. I did not go for walks past Phil's house to observe his situation. I went about my days, I prepared for the mediation, and when neighbors who knew the background asked me what was happening, I explained it factually and without editorializing. Several of them had enough context to do their own editorializing, which they did, and I did not discourage it, but I did not contribute to it either. What I did do was answer the phone calls. There were several of them, from board members I had barely spoken to before, from neighbors who had received Phil's HOA notices over the years and who were now putting together a fuller picture of his governance, and from 2 residents who had purchased their homes while Phil was president and who had been living under his fine regime without knowing that most of his provisions had been enacted improperly. Sandra had been right that the tree removal order was the case that would open the larger argument. The outage was the moment when the larger argument became visible to 47 households simultaneously. Patricia, who had been on the board as secretary for 2 years and who I learned during this period had been documenting her own concerns about Phil's practices for over a year, called me on the 3rd day of the outage. She asked me directly what I was pursuing through the lawsuit and whether there was any version of a resolution that did not require destroying the HOA in the process. This was a reasonable question, and I appreciated her asking it directly. I told her that what I wanted was specific and finite. I wanted the removal order for the oak tree withdrawn and the tree's protection confirmed. I wanted the fines returned. I wanted the improperly enacted provisions voided. And I wanted the cost of the entrance feature relocated and rebuilt at the HOA's expense, since the HOA was responsible for the encroachment. I told her I was not trying to dissolve the HOA or damage the neighborhood. I was trying to get back to the point where I had a neighbor that operated within the rules it had established rather than above them. Patricia said that sounded reasonable. She said she thought others on the board felt the same way, but that there was a conversation that needed to happen first, and she was working on making it happen. The conversation she was working on happened on day 7 of the outage, at an emergency board meeting she called with proper notice, which meant Phil could not object to it procedurally, though I am told he tried. 5 of the 7 board members attended. Phil attended. The meeting was not long. Patricia presented a summary of the legal situation, the civil suit, the county building department investigation, and the utility situation. She presented a summary of the provisions that Sandra had identified as procedurally invalid. She presented the cost estimates for the legal defense and the pillar relocation and the fine refunds, and she put a number on a whiteboard. The number was substantial. I do not have it precisely, but Sandra told me later that it was in the range of $90,000 when you included all the elements: legal defense, refunds, relocation, potential damages. The HOA's reserve fund was approximately $60,000. The gap between those 2 numbers was the amount of a special assessment against 47 homeowners who were currently living without power in October because their president had installed a brick pillar in the wrong place. 4 of the 5 board members present, excluding Phil, voted to enter settlement negotiations immediately. Phil's vote in opposition was noted and overruled. Patricia called Sandra that evening. The mediation was scheduled for the following Thursday, which was day 10 of the outage. Power was restored the following day, Friday, which was day 11. I want to be clear that the timing of the power restoration had nothing to do with the mediation. The utility's maintenance work was completed when it was completed, and the line was restored on the utility's timeline. The coincidence of timing was noted by everyone involved and commented upon, but it was a coincidence, and I would not want to suggest otherwise. The mediation was held in a conference room at a neutral location, a law office in town that provided mediation services. Sandra and I were on one side. The HOA's attorney, a man named Warren who had been retained specifically for the lawsuit, was on the other, along with Patricia and one other board member. Phil was not present. This had been Patricia's condition for participating in good faith negotiations, and Warren had apparently persuaded Phil to accept it on the grounds that Phil's presence would not be constructive. I thought that was an accurate assessment. The mediation took most of a day. Sandra had prepared thoroughly, as she always did, and the HOA's position was what I had expected from a party that was negotiating from a position of significant legal weakness. They wanted to resolve it. The question was terms. We settled on the following. The removal order for the oak tree was formally and permanently withdrawn. The HOA acknowledged, in a signed document, that the county's protected tree registry superseded any HOA landscape provision and that the tree would not be subject to any further removal proceedings. The fines Phil had assessed against me, totaling approximately $4,000 in actual notices, were refunded with interest. The visibility triangle provision that Phil had applied to the tree was voided as improperly enacted, along with 8 other provisions Sandra had identified in her analysis. The cost of relocating the entrance pillar and repairing my landscaping was covered by the HOA, which also covered my legal fees and my arborist costs. Dorothy Webb, my neighbor whose property had also been encroached on, received a separate settlement that Patricia had authorized before the mediation. On the question of the county building department investigation into the inaccurate site plan, that was a separate regulatory matter that the settlement could not address because it was not in our hands. The county's investigation proceeded on its own timeline and resulted in a finding of a permit violation and a fine against the HOA and a formal notation on the building permit record. Phil, as the responsible officer who had signed the site plan application, received a separate regulatory notice. The details of that are part of the county's public record, and I will leave them there. Phil resigned from the HOA presidency the week after the mediation. He did not make a statement. He submitted a brief written resignation to the board secretary, which Patricia later told me contained no explanation beyond the fact of the resignation, and that was that. 4 years of a neighborhood run like a private fiefdom ended with a paragraph that could have fit on a napkin. Patricia served as interim president while the board organized a proper election. She asked me if I would consider running. I told her I appreciated the thought and that I had spent most of the past year and a half managing the consequences of someone else's board decisions, and that I was more interested in returning to the business of living in my house than in running anything. She said she understood. She said she hoped things would be different going forward. I told her I thought they would be, and that I meant it. The election was held in the spring. 3 candidates ran for the 2 open board seats. All 3 of them had made statements at various points during the previous year about wanting a return to the kind of HOA Harold, Dave Kowalski, had run, the kind that organized block parties and dealt with genuine maintenance issues and otherwise let people live in their homes. The winner of the top vote was a woman named Angela Park, who had moved in 4 years ago and who had received 3 of Phil's enhancement notices in her first year, and had paid 2 fines rather than fight them, because fighting them seemed like more trouble than the money. Angela told me, when she stopped by to introduce herself as the new president, that she had used the mediation settlement as a reference document for what not to do and was keeping it in her files. I told her that was exactly the right place for it. The oak tree is fine. George Bettman came back in the spring for a routine check and said the tree was in excellent health for its age, root system solid, canopy full, and structurally sound. He said a well-maintained tree of this species and size could live another 50 to 100 years with good conditions. I stood under the canopy while he was talking and looked up through the branches at the April sky and thought about Thomas Ellison, who had put this tree in the ground intending for it to outlast him. It would outlast me too, probably. It would stand on this corner long after any of us involved in this story are gone, which struck me as the right outcome for something that was never about a tree in the first place. It was about the principle that a thing built slowly, carefully, over a long time, with intention and love and a promise made to an old man at a property closing, deserved to stand. That people in positions of authority do not have the right to take that kind of thing away because it does not fit their aesthetic program or their personal vision of how a neighborhood should look. That systems exist to protect things worth protecting, and that knowing how those systems work is its own kind of power, the quiet kind. The kind that does not require you to shout or threaten or do anything, except understand what you are entitled to and use the mechanisms available to you to defend it. I retired from the utility 11 years ago, but the knowledge I built over those 31 years did not retire with me. It lives in the way I read a property document and in the questions I know to ask and in the call I knew to make when I needed to. Thomas Ellison planted a tree because he wanted something that would last. I found a way to make sure it did. That, as far as I am concerned, is what a promise looks like when you actually keep it.